Hello and welcome to Cameo, XTV and Exeposé's brand new film review show. Each episode will be bringing you a whole host of film related content, including reviews, debates about film topics, and a deep dive at something that you might not have seen before.
So we'll be beginning by looking at two films from this term's release schedule, which are First Man and Halloween, before moving on to a debate about the Harry Potter franchise, and finally concluding with a look at the BBC's classic heritage of ghost and horror stories.
So, David, shall we just jump into it?
Let's go.
So first up we're going to look at First Man. David, what did you think?
Well, I really liked it. It's Damien Chazelle's third feature. I'm a huge fan of Whiplash. La La Land, I found there was some scripting issues, but it's a beautiful film to look at. I just thought slightly subpar on that front. It didn't exactly blow me away.
It's quite a departure from Chazelle's normal themes that he looks at.
Well, yeah. He's gone from, say, Whiplash and La La Land are both very musical films, and he's gone totally away from that. Both of them incorporate his passions, and this seems to be an example of him trying to prove to an audience that he can do something different.
Is there kind of like a musical element to this film? Because obviously seems to got a weird obsession with jazz from La La Land and Whiplash.
Not particularly. There are moments where music comes into play, the importance of it. Obviously, it's a character piece, and
because
there's a couple of moments where the characters play music. And
because it's telling the story of the moon landing, but it's not exactly focused on that as the event. It's more focused on Neil Armstrong's life.
Well, that's what I want to summarise the film first. It's basically follows from the start of the Apollo mission right to the end. It involves Neil Armstrong and his training, but the bold thing the film does, and the reason I really liked it so much, is because it doesn't focus on the space element so much in a way that a lot of previous films around this sort of subject matter do. It focuses entirely on the character of Neil Armstrong. It's very focused. It's incredibly bold to advertise a film like First Man, which is so inherently sort of seen as, I suppose, people, even though it's obviously a factual film, the moon obviously gives ideas of sci-fi tropes immediately, but it's not. It's more like, I found myself sort of thinking it was more almost Bergman-esque, like the close-ups of, like the film itself isn't Bergman-esque, but the way it uses close-ups is really quite astonishing.
Because Chazelle's made quite an interesting decision of how he's filmed this. Like a lot of it's shot with old film stock, like 16mm.
Well, that's the other brilliant thing about the film, is that to highlight this sort of difference is the moon stuff itself is filmed on IMAX, and it's minimal compared to the rest of the film. Then the domestic stuff is 35mm. And then all the all the test stuff is in 16mm, so you get a real contrast of the different.
Does that come across in the film?
Yeah, and it's just really brave, in my opinion, to take this subject matter and go, okay, we're going to create quite an intimate character piece instead. We're going to, and really the heart of the film, and credit to Chazelle for putting his trust in them completely, is Ryan Gosling and Claire Foy.
Yeah, what about the performances?
Who are absolutely, I mean, it's their film, essentially. Yeah. They are both terrific. They both sell it, and credit to them as well for giving Claire Foy a proper role. She is not just the wife of Neil Armstrong. It's also, so much of the film focuses on the domestic element and them having to move nearer to the base, etc., and the struggles that she goes through as well. And there's a beautifully poignant scene that's so well played, where it's sort of the domestic life and Neil Armstrong's life as an astronaut come crashing together, where she basically makes him sit down in front of the children and tell them, you might not be coming back. And that's where First Man really, really works well. It really works well when it's doing those intimate moments, and it makes the space stuff, the stuff when they're on the ship, things like that, it makes it feel tense. It makes it feel like there's some extraordinarily well done scenes where they go on to, they're really the highlights of the film as well, the moments in the test shuttle where you realise just how vulnerable these people are. Like the initial sequence where they go onto the shuttle and you realise it's this shabby piece of junk, like they're sending these people on what is basically a suicide mission in some ways. You realise just that now we take it for granted, the moon landing, but the film's main accomplishment is that it makes you realise just how much of an achievement it was, just how much of a chance there was that they weren't coming back.
And what about the moon landing sequence itself?
Terrific as well.
Yeah.
A really, really terrific sequence. One that opens up with, it would be a shame to spoil it, but there was a moment that did leave me really quite stunned. It's a very simple moment, but it just sort of really without any real trickery or anything like that, sort of lets you take in the majesty and awe of the moment, and that's where the film works well.
Summarise, what do you think overall?
Well, overall, like, I wanted to just before I summarise, I wanted to sort of say about, there were a few criticisms I had, mainly with the script. Like, I felt that Chizelle's intentions were to create quite a realistic piece, and when it works well, it is when it's hammering home the realism of the event, things like that. But at the same time, the script itself does fall into the traps of Hollywood artifice sometimes, and it really does bring the film down. It really
more so than Chizelle's other films, which he also wrote.
There's very much, well, with those films they could get away with being artificial because they were fictional stories and they weren't pretending to be hyper-real films. This does. It's part of the reason the film's intention in the first place is that it's trying to be realistic, to feel like a real interpretation of these events. And there's this emotional through line with his daughter, that sometime his daughter died, and that's kind of the main emotional thread throughout the film. And I understand, obviously, you have to have an arc for the character, but at times it feels very forced and very much like the screenwriters have suddenly gone, oh right, we need to have our emotional beat here, and it's a shame because it does take. And of course, that sometimes it really works, and you really do feel his grief. But there's moments, especially towards the end, and you will know exactly the moment when you see it.
I think I've heard about this, but
and it takes you out of it so much because it does not feel real. And when you read about it afterwards,
it's not real. It didn't happen.
It didn't happen, and it really does take you out of it because it feels like a screenwriter's conception.
Do you think that was the screenwriters or Chazelle coming in and making it?
I'm pretty sure it's the screenwriters from what I've read, and it's just a shame because it sort of prevents the film from heading up to the stratosphere.
Yeah. On that analogy.
Very contrived.
Summarise before we move on to Halloween. What did you think overall? Recommend it? Or?
I would certainly recommend it. But I feel Chazelle has better in him. I feel like it's an incredible promise. It's shown that he's diverse.
Yeah.
It's shown that he's diverse.
Well, he's 3 for 3, essentially.
Yeah, exactly. And it's excellent film.
Do you think he'll go kind of along the same line now, or go somewhere completely different?
I think he'll go somewhere completely different.
Jazz in space?
I think... and a space musical. No, I do think he'll go somewhere else. I think he'll try something a bit different, because I think that's what he's trying to do. He's trying to challenge himself and prove to people that he's one of the most diverse filmmakers in Hollywood, which is what he seems to be doing.
Yeah, definitely.
So, yes,
brilliant.
Definitely recommend.
Cool. Should we move on to Halloween? What did you think?
So, at the end of Halloween,
yeah,
I felt like I never wanted to watch another Halloween film in my life.
Right. What do you mean by that?
I don't actually mean that in a bad way.
Right.
I mean it in the way that I think they perfectly summarise the franchise in a way that needs no more. I don't think there was any need for a Halloween film anyway, and I went into this film incredibly cynical.
Yeah. Because you know quite a lot about the Halloween franchise.
I depressingly have seen all of the Halloween films.
I've seen all of them up to the present one, and they're odd, aren't they? Some of them go a bit... Busta Rhymes is in a bit
the Busta Rhymes cameo, well, not cameo, he's a character. Is bizarre, and there's stuff about occult rituals. Michael Myers has a son at one point.
It goes weird because this one kind of gets rid of all the other films apart from the first one.
Yeah, which the franchise has already tried doing twice in its past. Anyway, it's rebooted itself about, I want to say something like 3 times already. So again, hearing we're going to scrap all the sequels and start again didn't exactly fill me with confidence. I thought, I've seen this happen before.
But it's good. We're bringing back Jamie Lee Curtis, obviously, in probably her most iconic role.
Well, it's absolutely her film.
Yeah.
She absolutely owns this film. Like, I was speaking to someone earlier today, and we were just saying how wonderful it is to see an elderly female character get such a strong, brilliant role. And it's totally, that's the brilliance of this film, because it doesn't just try to make it another Halloween film. It becomes a film about trauma. It becomes a film about Laurie Strode, Jamie Lee Curtis' character. So the film is essentially set 40 years after the first Halloween.
Ignoring anything that
Ignoring anything. Michael Myers has been locked up.
Yeah.
He's let out. He's obviously gets let loose after breaking out of an asylum bus and begins wreaking havoc. And Laurie Strode has been scarred ever since that incident. It's severed her ties from her daughter and then her granddaughter subsequently. And it basically becomes a film about her and the way in which this trauma has enveloped her entire life. That's a beautiful shot at the start of the film, where it's a mirror of the first scene from Halloween, except it's her granddaughter sitting at a school desk. In the first film, it's Laurie Strode. She looks out the window and she sees Michael Myers. When her granddaughter looks out the window in this film, she sees Laurie. and it's showing how Laurie has taken the trauma that Michael's brought through the ages, and it's still there.
So it's David Gordon Green who's directed this?
David Gordon Green's directed this. Which
Do you think he's done a good job with it?
It's quite an odd choice. Oh, I think he's done a very good job. It's not perfect by any means. It's still a Halloween film. It's, I think, the middle section of the film, which becomes very much the usual generic stabby, Michael Myers doing his thing type, is a bit dull. There's a ludicrous twist, and it also feels... I want to say it feels like it tries hard. There's a long tracking shot and things like that, which feels like him trying to mix things up, but it doesn't quite work. But the first act and the last act are so strong that doesn't matter that much. Like, it's obviously, it means it's not a perfect film, and it's not particularly scary either. But what it does in terms of deconstructing the franchise and looking at it with nostalgic, but also not rose-tinted glasses, is really clever.
Well, he's clearly a fan of the franchise, isn't he?
Yeah.
And he's kind of bringing elements that he likes about the original into a new era.
Yeah, well, I thought, and the ending, the way he brings it into the new era is obviously Halloween is not entirely correctly, in my view, considered the formative slasher.
Right.
In my opinion, there's some better slashers before it from Italy and things like that, but it is undoubtedly influential.
Yeah.
And the film sort of almost, by making it about Laurie and her struggle, and not so much about Michael's there, but it's far more about Laurie, and the way the film goes on, it takes on this almost feminist slant as the film goes on. It feels like slashers are a genre that I think unfairly maligned in some ways, but they are undoubtedly, there is a male gaze there, there's very much victimisation of women. And what this film does, especially in its last act, feels like a reclaiming of it for women, which is a really interesting
That's an interesting choice to make.
Yeah, and I think it's a really bold, brilliant choice, and I think the ending the franchise there on that note is a very positive...
Well, it's done quite well, so it probably won't be the end of the
Well,
franchise.
I've already heard them say they've been saving characters for sequels, so I will be probably back here in a year's time ranting about how it all could have been so good and how they've all ruined it.
Yeah.
But
what about some of the negatives of it? Did you think there were things that could have been improved? Or?
Well, like I said, the middle sequence is just dull in my opinion.
So it starts good, kind of has a lull.
I mean, it's not terrible. It's not like as offensively bad as, say, the franchise has been, but it is just the same old. And I don't think the chills or the suspense are enough to really make up for that. I don't think it's really particularly, considering as well, like the sort of, I don't know, something like Hereditary, which I think plays with suspense very well, and shocks, I think. There was no moment, say in Hereditary, there was a moment that left the cinema breathless, and there's a few other modern horrors that I've had similar experiences with. There's nothing in this that I felt left anyone particularly beyond a couple of moments of slight suspense. There's nothing.
If it wasn't a Halloween film, do you think it would be a very forgettable one? Forgettable horror film?
In a way, if it was just this film on its bare bones, probably, because what works relies on the fact that it's studying Halloween's legacy. When it works, it's working because it's about the impact all the events of Halloween had all those years ago. Halloween needs to exist for this film to exist, essentially. It's not that standalone.
Right.
So the scares in it itself aren't amazing, and like I said, they try, and there's some nice ideas there, but I never feel they quite come to fruition. But for the first act, and a really, well, not scary, it is definitely thrilling. That's the thing I'll say. It may not be scary, but it is definitely thrilling, and ultimately a really enjoyable experience. So I came out so pleasantly surprised at that film, because I was sure I was going to dislike it.
Right.
So
overall a recommendation then? Absolutely
a recommend. If you're into the Halloween franchise, or if you just want something fun for Halloween to go and watch, well, it's past Halloween now, but if you still feel in the Halloween spirit at all, it's definitely one to go and watch.
Brilliant. I think that's a good way to sum up before we move on to the review section now. Let's move on to the debate.
Welcome to the debate section. This section will be a regular feature where we discuss a column and exposé relating to one of the latest feature films out.
Now, to celebrate the release of Fantastic Beasts: The Crimes of Grindelwald, we're going to be looking at Harry Bunting's recent article on the Harry Potter film series. So guys, what did you think about the article?
I thought it was a really interesting article how he wasn't overly negative. His opinion was, I couldn't care less for this franchise that has been celebrated and lauded as a British cultural heritage for so many years. I found his just complete ambivalence quite fun to read, even if I didn't totally agree with it. It was at least he didn't completely slam it. He was just completely uncaring.
Well, what did you think? What do you think about the Harry Potter films?
I grew up on them like many other people my age, and I do have a special place in my heart for them because of that reason. I think as films, especially as the later they go on, there are definitely flaws to be found, but I think my kind of nostalgia and just childhood love for them means I can pretty much overcome that, and I can just kind of ignore them and go off that. But I think there's definitely a lot to discuss and dissect with them, especially their weird history with director changes and tonal changes. It's a very unique franchise in that sense.
Anyone want to jump in?
I think I would agree with some points in the article that the actual filming of the Harry Potter series and how it's directed and those kind of things maybe doesn't make them the best films in the world, but I think a lot of the obsession and the hype, for example, he mentions people doing quizzes to find out which house they'd be in or where they'd have been sorted. That kind of stuff just comes from the enjoyment of the storyline and the whole world, because it's such a detailed world that J.K. Rowling creates. I mean, I've personally watched the films and read the books a lot of times, and each time I think of something new and learn a bit more about that world, so I think that's partly where the hype comes from.
Jerry, you've got different views.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of the article, I agree. My only issue with it really is that I don't think it quite gets to the grips with the issues with the franchise. I mean, particularly with Fantastic Beasts, I think there's a huge amount of storytelling issues with justifying the existence of that franchise. But also in terms of just talking about Harry Potter being overrated, I don't think it quite gets into detail of why there are people who think this is just I don't care about this. It's very much a case of I don't care, but it's not a case of why, which I think would be a more interesting discussion to get into.
What's interesting, Mavang, we were talking earlier about the fact that you're a bit different to some Harry Potter fans and that you became a fan when you were 16, which is a lot of people associate with your childhood, so you probably have a more objective viewpoint.
I wasn't really, it isn't a kind of childhood nostalgia and love for the films or the story in general that I have, and so I find that, but I still enjoy it in that kind of way, but perhaps my encounter with the story was always a bit more critical and I was a bit more skeptical about certain elements that people may find hard to kind of reconcile as they get older. So I thought this article would go more into kind of the problematic aspects of the series and talking about why there's relative representation and issues with Dumbledore and the representation of Severus Snape and kind of the morality involved in these characters. So I thought that was what was going to be discussed in the article. So I agree with Harry in the way that it is overhyped or not kind of challenged in that kind of way, but not exactly with the kind of reasons he was explaining in the article. It was boring, he found it boring, and I mean, again, it's maybe not the best cinematic experience, but I think what people enjoy about the series, especially me, I don't even like Harry Potter that much as a person. You enjoy the periphery characters, you enjoy the world building involved, you enjoy the kind of community that you can engage with people who can understand what's going on in lingo. It's very involving. It's this kind of escape into this other world. The wizarding world is what people enjoy about the franchise, and that's probably why it's sustained more than purely just Harry Potter as a character and the storyline involved. I think that's what people enjoy about the movies, and I don't think it is overhyped in that aspect.
So I suppose you've mentioned the problematic issues involved in it. Does anyone have any thoughts on that? Certainly there's been debate about Rowling's attitude towards sexuality, inclusion, other cultures, etc.
I think my main issue with those topics is that I admire J.K. Rowling's attempts to cater to different audiences and cater for everyone, but my problem is, as I think also, as we were discussing earlier, is that especially with Fantastic Beasts, it doesn't feel like they're actually, these seem to be being integrated smartly into the plot. They're more just there as sort of tokens of representation more than anything. I mean, it's one thing saying that a character has is this sexuality or is this colour or is this race, but it's another to actually incorporate it intelligently into the plot and use it as to develop that character rather than just define that character by that, which is what I worry that the franchise, at least the Fantastic Beasts franchise, is gearing towards. Now granted, we've only had one film. I haven't seen Grindelwald yet, but I do worry that's where it's tracking.
I do think that's interesting to see with the next film that comes out. I know you were mentioning earlier whether they'll explore Dumbledore and Grindelwald's relationship.
Yeah.
Because it is obviously very interesting, but it's whether the film is going to tackle that or just kind of glance over it, because I think the problem with these new films is that I do feel a little bit like they're just clinging on to the franchise and getting the hype, and because everyone's already interested in Harry Potter, people just go and see it because, oh, it's another Harry Potter film.
Yeah.
And I think the next film that comes out will be interesting to see whether they actually really delve into the deep issues or just have it as another film that everybody enjoys because it's Harry Potter.
I think one of the issues with that is that delving into the specific storylines in the prequel thing, in a setting like Fantastic Beasts, you can't impact the way that Harry Potter narrative plays out. So there's a tendency to kind of have to play to everything that was set forward in the Harry Potter story. You can't change those things, which makes going back to a prequel series that has no real foundation and you can do anything so restrictive because you actually can't do anything. You know, there's a whole bunch of things you could get into with these characters, but you start developing these characters and pushing them in certain directions that don't align with where they are in the Harry Potter story, means that it's an invalid prequel essentially.
I suppose it's based on it though, isn't it? You can have a bit of license that it's not, doesn't have to be factually everything the same as the books if it's kind of based on them. Isn't that the idea with them?
Yeah, but I mean the issue with a prequel is that it has to lead up to the actual series. So I mean there's nothing wrong with like developing relationships in prequels, but if you change the nature of those relationships as they're represented in the actual canon stories, it kind of delegitimizes
Next films
it.
where it makes sense.
Yeah, exactly. Like you know, you have to lead into everything that happened in order for it to be legitimate, to be an effective prequel. And so there's a tendency to restrict yourself in what you can do with prequels like this.
I think in the article as well, the fact that Harry pointed out the weakness of certain characters was quite interesting, because what I realised when I saw the first Fantastic Beasts is that as nice as the visuals were, as enjoyable as the world was, the fact that they were obviously, the original Harry Potter characters were not in the film, I started to realise that it actually felt quite hollow for that reason. And actually, as much as Harry doesn't, I think particularly Harry Potter as a character himself was quite weak, I found myself actually missing those characters, and it made me realise how integral my enjoyment of the original films, how integral the characters were to that, because without them, Fantastic Beasts, at least the first one to me, did feel quite empty and a bit lacking that spark that the original films did.
Well, it goes to David Yates, who's obviously been directing the series since the fifth film.
Yeah.
I have kind of a love-hate relationship with him, because I think he's probably made some of the bravest choices in the Harry Potter franchise, but he's also very safe at the same time, which is kind of like some of the choices he's made, like the dance sequence in the first part of the Deathly Hallows. I thought that was probably the best part of in terms of cinema, in terms of like actually kind of style. That's one of the bravest choices ever. But then again, I see what you mean with the Fantastic Beasts franchise. It does seem very kind of playing to the bigger audience. There's nothing very niche about it.
There's nothing, and I guess I'd say like with word niche, well, Harry Potter's never been necessarily niche. It's still there was still something special about it. There was still something unique about its interpretation of sort of
true.
mundane.
In comparison to something like Alfonso Cuarón, who did the third film, like in terms of cinema.
Oh no, I totally agree.
In terms of the way he filmed that, it's complete. It's on a different level to what you get in the fifth and sixth.
But I think that's also the thing about Cuarón is, in my opinion, every other director of Harry Potter has approached it as straight adaptation, whereas for Cuarón it was more what's the fuel for cinema. How do you make this a cinematic experience? Whereas the rest of it's been, okay, how do we just take the books and put them on a screen? Which can be fine, but if we're talking about cinema, at least Cuarón was attempting to do something that made the material fit cinema rather than the other way around.
I also think that was the most manageable book, because when you get to the fourth, fifth,
But I think that's also the thing, them being books, you have such a breadth of things to do. And I think that's one of the issues, at least that I found with the first Fantastic Beasts, is that J.K. Rowling is capable of doing such great world building and building these stories over the novelistic structure, fitting it into a 2-hour screenplay. You really see how much is not getting in there.
I feel what it proved as well is how much, while she is a very good, accomplished novelist in many respects, I think as a screenwriter, she had a lot to learn.
Yeah,
I think it's quite. For me, anyway, I agree with you. It's quite a plain film. It's quite the first Fantastic Beasts, and it has lots of ideas that, on the surface, are quite interesting, but it never really gets to grips with them.
I think that also comes with a kind of a difficulty in understanding where to put the focus in the screenplay.
Yeah,
you don't have the breadth of a novel. You can't do all these things. So to do all the setups, all the world building setups, all the plot setups that are required in the first part of a 5-part franchise, you kind of have to figure out where specifically to deploy the character development stuff, which is something that I think she didn't quite understand how to do. And that's where adapting comes into play. I think because it's still a very novelistic franchise, it requires an actual screenwriter to say this is how you make it work for the screen, rather than this is how you make the story work.
I think quite a difference as well with the Fantastic Beasts films is I found the first one very enjoyable in terms of the effect and just watching the film and the visuals, but one key difference between those films and the earlier ones based on the novels is that the novels were quite relatable to sort of teenage viewers, as the characters were at school, there was the relationship issues, them coping with work, and it was quite relatable, whereas I find the Fantastic Beasts film is quite a bit more focused on the fantasy and all the magical animals, which personally I found a bit less enjoyable than the earlier films, where I found there were quite a few things I could relate to as sort of a teenage girl going through school. So maybe it's a bit harder in that sense to get the hype up for the Fantastic Beasts film.
I mean, I'm actually kind of the opposite, because I've always had difficulty getting on board with teenage characters, and especially when I was a teenager, getting on board with characters who were doing these things. I go, no, you wouldn't do that. That's how you do it. No, you do. That's what you do. So the fact that it moved, because actually one of my biggest issues with Harry Potter in general was the Hogwarts setting. The most interesting stuff for me was all the stuff that's going on in the periphery that you never get to see much. My favourite characters, were in it for very little and get killed, and I'm like, I don't care. And so Fantastic Beasts going, it's about auroras, it's about people with jobs, it's about people who do this stuff for a living and know what they're doing, and more about getting out into the actual world. I was like, I'm more likely to get on board with that. But then the big issue was that you never get into the characters.
But in terms of the demographic of who these films are actually based for...
I'm speaking about me, not the whole
True,
audience. Not the whole audience, but...
These films aren't based for, A, cinephiles, or B, people who are like...
I'm not saying it's a
for
criticism of
teenagers,
the franchise, I'm just saying why I can't get on board with that kind of thing.
So really to conclude the conversation, guys, what do you think about the future of the Harry Potter franchise? JK has apparently 5 Fantastic Beasts films in there. Yeah. Well, we're on the second now, so she's got 3 more to go, basically. Wow. She's mapped it all out, which in a sense ties in with our discussion that she is a novelist at heart, and I suppose it's a much wider spanning story. But the question is, does this story really warrant it?
No.
I feel like J.K. Rowling, she's known for planning meticulously all the events in advance. Like the Harry Potter books are famous for the fact that everything was structured very neatly.
So many details.
Yeah, so part of me thinks, if she has done 5 films for Fantastic Beasts, and there's clearly an end game. But again, judging from the first one I've seen and what seems to be a reception of the Crimes of Grindelwald, I'm starting to lose hope of it. Again, J.K. Rowling's ability as a screenwriter and David Yates' originality as a director. So I'm keeping my fingers crossed that it's all going to pay off in the end. But I feel I do have some strong doubt coming in.
Yeah, I think I even question why this story had to be as film. Why didn't she continue writing novels? Where's that kind of reluctance to continue along that path? And maybe you're even overcrediting her kind of attention for detail. If you're a good writer, you have to be detailed. Obviously, your story's going to fall apart if you're not planning in advance, or at least, going back to make sure that everything makes sense. And she definitely does have some kind of things that feel kind of rushed as well, which I understand, but became a bit more hyped up. There's a lot of pressure for her to deliver. So I think, again, I kind of grew, even with The Cursed Child, I was really interested in that story in that respect, because I don't know, it felt like it needed to be put to rest. And even the epilogue of the Deathly Hallows, I felt like it wasn't necessary. It undermined a lot of what she was accomplishing, and the world of Harry Potter, again, why people love it, it belongs to them, and she's kind of continually interrupting this kind of this fan interaction with these stories, with these narratives, and it feels like we're gonna have no scope left. She's gonna do prequels, she's gonna do a sequel again, we're gonna find out about the great grandkids of Harry Potter.
That's one of the things I hate
fill up the timeline,
in any prequel is when they're like, it's this person.
It's their children now.
It ruins the fun of wondering if she answers all the questions.
I don't think they need to be answered.
Yeah, it's part of the interest in reading and watching them.
Well, I think that sums it up very nicely. I think Harry Potter's an important part of our lives, and we'll move on and see what she does with it in the future.
Yeah, skeptically.
Brilliant, thank you so much for coming,
guys. Thank you for coming, guys.
Cheers.
That's a very interesting conversation. And so now we move on to our next section, which is called Deep Dive, which looks at some of the lesser known areas of cinema. This week we're not actually looking at cinema, we're looking at television, but these mini-films are very cinematic in their own right. They were produced by the BBC throughout the 1970s, and they're a real haunting treat. I hope you enjoy.
you stay. Wait it. Who is this? Who is coming? Well, we shall blow it and see.
The clip you just saw there is of Michael Hordern's sceptical professor reading out a warning to himself in the 1968 production of Whistle and I'll Come to You, directed by Jonathan Miller, one of the seminal examples of the classic ghost story. An adaptation of M.R. James's classic ghost story, Whistle and I'll Come to You, My Lad, the piece involves the professor holidaying on the Suffolk coast and uncovering an old bone whistle. However, when he blows on it, a supernatural force seems to start following him, getting closer and closer. As the piece goes on, his faith in rationality and science begins to crumble, leading to a final confrontation with the supernatural he's defied all his life. Though when he blew on that whistle, that wasn't the only thing he summoned into existence. Broadcast around the Christmas period, Whistle and I'll Come to You brought into existence a brand new strand for the BBC, a ghost story for Christmas. And as November ends and December begins to creep into vision, I always find myself revisiting these strange, otherworldly stories. The stories that followed included many more adaptations of M.R. James' shorts, including Lost Hearts, with its insidious little children, and A Warning to the Curious, with a demonic figure stalking the English landscape. These played on very particular English anxieties, and these little mini-films at Christmas were a reminder of the darker heart of our country. However, not all of the stories were M.R. James adaptations. In fact, the highlight of the whole strand might be The Signalman, an adaptation of Charles Dickens' classic short story. The piece involves Denham Elliott giving a powerhouse performance as a lonely signalman who sees apparitions every time an accident is about to happen on his train station. It's an intense, claustrophobic work of art, and not only one of the best pieces on the strand, but one of the best things the BBC has ever produced in its entire lifetime. These dramas were produced by the BBC until 1978, meaning essentially they were making ghost stories for an entire decade. And though they might seem quite unusual within the festive period, there's actually something quite warm and comforting about them, like cozying up around the fire for a classic ghostly tale. So, as Halloween draws to a close and you start to put up the Christmas lights, give a thought to the spectral undercurrent of England's soil.
Thank you so much for watching the first episode of Cameo. I've been Jamie Johnstone.
I've been David Conway.
And we'll see you next time. Thank you. Bye.
Yeah, that's nice.
Because